No, it's my honor, really. I really admire
Thank you
all
so
of
much.
you for staying so strong and continuing your studies. It's amazing, really.
Thank you so much. So if you feel we could, the students will be joining in, we would be very happy. Maybe we could start and then we'll be joining in. Absolutely.
Of course.
Thank you so much.
Start, or do you want me to start?
Of course, we would like you to start. Absolutely.
Okay. Well, thank you, Ale, and
thank you so much.
Hello, everyone.
I would like, with your kind permission, I would wish to introduce you, if possible. Yeah, dear Gulnoza. So, dear Karazin Kharkiv National University community, today we have a very special guest, a very honored guest, and a great supporter of journalistic world. We've got with us Gulnozi Sаїd. We've got with us the person who is a journalist, press freedom advocate. We've got with us Europe and Central Asia program coordinator. Dear Gulnoza represents the Committee for Journalist Protection, and today she's going to give a guest lecture for Karazin residents. Gulnozi Sаїd is a journalist and a press freedom advocate with over 20 years of professional experience in such cities as New York, Prague, Bratislava, Tashkent, and many others. Dear Gulnoza has conducted several missions to countries in Europe and Central Asia and advocated for greater press freedom and the release of jailed journalists at forums including the US Congress, the United Nations, and the OSCE. Before joining the Committee for Protection of Journalists in 2016, she was a journalist and covered issues including elections, politics, media, religion, and human rights, with a focus on Central Asia, Russia, and Turkey. She also worked in communications for the United States Secretariat and the UNDP. Her OBDs, reports, and comments have appeared in CNN, the BBC, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Guardian, PBS, NBS, and many others. Expressing her support for the courageous Karazin students, the city of Kharkiv and Ukraine, and Versailles Karazin University, of course, Gulnozi Sаїd emphasizes the total absence of a free press in Russia. Dear Gulnoza will be addressing our community, Karazin National University community, talking about the activities of the Committee for Journalist Protection, the Committee to Protect Journalists, PPJ, where she leads the work on Europe and Central Asia, and will be focusing on its readiness to help Ukrainian journalists in trouble, both in Ukraine and abroad. I would like to let you know that the Committee for Journalist Protection has issued safety guidelines for journalists covering events in Ukraine and is doing much work to protect them. This lecture is a part of a series of lectures at Vasil Nazarovich Karazin Kharkiv National University, Lecture to Victory, and will be the 9th within this initiative. Dear Gulnoza, we are extremely grateful and most honored to have you, and I would gladly give you the floor. Thank you so much for your time and for your support.
Thank you, Ale, for this long introduction. I immediately felt older than I am while you read all those details from my professional bio. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone, wherever you are. I'm joining you from New York. As Ale said, I work for the Committee to Protect Journalists, the international non-governmental organization that works on ensuring greater press freedom and safety of journalists worldwide. And I lead CPJ's work in Europe and Central Asia that includes Russia, Ukraine, and many other countries. You know, I recently traveled to Washington, D.C. I was on a business trip and I stayed at a hotel. And in my hotel room, there was a picture on the wall, a very small one with no description, but it got my interest because on that photo, you could see Boris Yeltsin, then president of Russia, with Bill Clinton, then president of the United States, and a couple of other people in the background. And in the photo, Bill Clinton was playing a saxophone. and Yeltsin was looking at him smiling, and the general atmosphere in the photo was very friendly and relaxing. Yeltsin was in a suit, and Clinton was wearing just a shirt, and all of them had these very smiley faces. And it was amazing to see that photo, because there were times when the relationships between Russia and the West, particularly the United States, were pretty warm, and both countries tried to have good relations in many different areas. And fast forward to 2023, today we heard about the court in Moscow upholding decision to detain an American journalist, Evan Gershkovich, who is accused of espionage. And this is the first case since 1986 when another American journalist was accused of espionage. So this case of Evan Gershkovich immediately brings us back to the Cold War era. And if you look at the relationships, not just the relationships between Russia and the West, but also the state of the media in Russia, right now the situation is not much different from the Stalinist era, when all media have been controlled by the state, and only state propaganda was allowed. And whoever was brave enough to say anything that didn't correspond to the Kremlin established narrative got punished. And this is exactly the situation in Russia right now. Being a journalist was never easy in Russia. Maybe with the exception of just a few years in late 1980s and early 1990s, when there were lots of journalists trying to exercise freedom of speech. And the media outlets that those journalists worked for were not necessarily independent in true sense. They were also owned by oligarchs like Berezovsky, who had their own political interests and aspirations. But if you watch those shows that are probably still available somewhere on YouTube now from those years, and some shows like Vzгляд, they were able to discuss quite serious issues without being in trouble. But as soon as Yeltsin appointed Putin as his successor, one of the first things that Putin started doing is trying to establish a control over media. So a lot of media outlets, including the biggest television channel and some other TV channels like NTV that used to be pretty liberal, changed hands, changed ownerships, and Putin worked very hard with people in his circle to create a new image of himself and to control the narrative. Because now, if we look back at those times, we know, and also if you if you have any interest in Russian recent history, and if you've read books on it, you can tell that even from that time, Putin was already building this empire of wealth for himself, a very corrupt state indeed. And in order for the information about his deals not to get to free media, he needed that control of the media. And at the same time, he was working, his team was working on creating this image of a strong leader. And you probably have seen some photos of Putin shirtless, riding a bear, or swimming somewhere, or maybe riding a horse, and so on. So comparing to previous leader, Boris Yeltsin, who was, in his latest years of his leadership, he was known as a person who often appeared drunk in the public. Putin's team decided to create this very new image of the president. And but even during those years when journalists were relatively free to express their opinions and to write freely, the situation was not safe for journalists. So a lot of journalists were killed during that time. And if we look at the entire period of Russia, starting 1992, when we at CPJ started keeping records and documenting the cases of journalists being killed and being imprisoned, you could see that since 1992 up to today, more than 80 journalists and media workers have been killed in Russia, and more than 38 of them were contract-style murders of journalists in direct retaliation for their work as journalists. And out of those cases, only in 2 full justice was achieved. And among those journalists are some prominent names like Anna Politkovskaya and Natalia Estemirova, who covered human rights abuses in Chechnya, as you probably know. And then there were foreign journalists, including an editor of Forbes Russia, Paul Klebnikov, who was gunned down in Moscow in 2004. And there is still impunity in his case. And also in the cases of Natalia Estemirova and Anna Politkovskaya. In Politkovskaya's case, some of those who executed the murder were brought to justice, but not the masterminds. And then, because I mentioned Vzгляд, one of those people who worked there, Vlad Listiev, was also killed more than 25 years ago in Moscow, as you probably know. And murder is the ultimate way to silence a journalist. And another way is to imprison them. And if you look at Russia today, there are more than 20 journalists in Russian jails right now, including at least 7 Ukrainian journalists from Crimea. And that is the highest number ever for Russia, even. And the number of murders of journalists slowly decreased over the years because the Russian authorities started using other tools to silence journalists. And as I said, imprisonment is one of them, but they also have changed the legislation, making it very difficult to report independently. And 2012 was important in terms of press freedom in Russia because they made this legislation on undesirable organizations. So, if you worked and if you worked for a media outlet or for any other organization, basically that has some activities that the authorities didn't like, you could have been labeled undesirable. And that would make it very difficult for you to continue working. And then the legislation on foreign agents, as you know, even before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, we saw a lot of journalists and media outlets being included one after the next in the registry that the Russian Ministry of Justice had on foreign agents, media foreign agents, as they said. Media outlets and journalists were included. And I also wanted to mention that because I spoke about Evan Gershkovich's case, that although this is the first American journalist since the Cold War who is accused of espionage, he is not the first journalist and he is not the first foreign journalist. And I wanted to mention the case of Ivan Safronov, who is serving 22 years on the charges of state treason. And he was also accused of spying for the Czech Republic and Germany. He's a Russian journalist. He was he covered a military complex, among other issues. He was very well known to Russian journalists in Moscow, and even to officials, because he was included in the Putin's presidential pool. But then the authorities brought these charges, and the investigation was very secretive. The trial was held behind closed doors, and then he was sentenced to 22 years. That case got quite a lot of attention because, as I said, a lot of journalists in Moscow knew him personally and couldn't believe that he was actually spying, especially because he was in the presidential pool. And if you are included in the presidential pool, you have to go through a very rigorous background check. So the security services check you, check your activities and communication in order to allow you to these, let me say, privileged group of journalists who cover president himself. So those charges were ridiculous. And another case of a journalist accused of espionage in Russia in recent years did not get much coverage in Russia, probably because the journalist was Ukrainian. Roman Sushchenko worked as a Paris-based correspondent of the Ukrainian state news agency Ukrinform when he traveled to Moscow to visit relatives, and the Russian security services detained him in 2016. And he was in detention in Lefortovo, the same detention as Gershkovich now, and Safronov at one point. And nobody knew where he was for several days until members of the monitoring commission that visits prisons spotted him, were able to talk to him. And that's how the information got out about him being in Lefortovo and the charges of espionage. And he was also tried. We at CPJ worked very hard to get him released. I had a meeting with the spokesperson of the Russian Foreign Ministry to discuss the case of Sushchenko, among several other cases of journalists who were in detention in Russia at the time. And the official from the Foreign Ministry refused to discuss Sushchenko's case. She said he is a spy. And we were in touch. I was in touch with his family and lawyers. But again, the case was very secretive. The trial was held behind closed doors. We couldn't get much information, especially because when lawyers are hired to defend people like that, they often cannot speak too much about the details. They cannot share the details of the case. So what we did when Zelensky was elected president of Ukraine, we wrote him a letter highlighting press freedom and several cases, including Sushchenko. And we asked him to consider including Sushchenko, and then there was Stanislav Aseyev, who was detained by so-called pro-Russian separatists in Donbass, to include them in prisoners exchange. And that did happen in September 2019. So Sushchenko got back to safety in Ukraine. Aseyev got back as well. And unfortunately, I think prisoner exchange is one of the ways that we can also see in Gershkovich, because I don't see any chance for Gershkovich's acquittal, just speaking from the experience. And as I said, the case of Sushchenko wasn't covered much by Russian journalists, probably because he was not known to too many of them. He never worked in Russia, as far as I know. He worked in France, as I said, but also because Ukraine and Russia were already at war with each other, and after the occupation of Crimea, but until last February, I think a lot of Russian journalists were not willing to cover Ukraine very openly, because after the full-scale invasion, it became very clear that you're either with, and with the authorities and support the Russian government policies and the war, or you're against the war. So it became more clear that one has to take that position, and the position has to be very clear. But until then, even some prominent liberals, people from liberal circles of Russia were not openly condemning the occupation of Crimea. And in my view, the occupation of Crimea until last February was a litmus test, just to see whether a person is truly independent or not, or trying to, maybe have a more comfortable position without condemning it, but at the same time without really voicing their support for the occupation and for the war in eastern Ukraine. What did happen after February 2022 is that Russian authorities started amending the legislation once again, introducing these new articles to the criminal code about fakes. So it became very practically impossible. I wanted to say very difficult, but practically impossible to cover the war in Ukraine without being accused of disseminating fakes. Of course, if you wanted to cover it in an independent way, not supporting the Kremlin narrative, the Kremlin propaganda on the war. So a lot of journalists have fled Russia, dozens, if not hundreds, and they are now based elsewhere, and a lot of media outlets had to also relocate and continue their activities from different countries, from Georgia and Latvia and the Netherlands and so on. Quite a few media outlets have been closed, as you know. For example, I mentioned Novaya Gazeta previously. So Novaya Gazeta, the authorities closed Novaya Gazeta step by step, blocking the website and then not allowing them to print the newspaper and so on. And part of the team relocated to Latvia and continued under a new name, Novaya Gazeta Europe. And some other prominent media outlets had to, they were silenced for some time, for weeks or months last year, but then they relaunched their activities. I also wanted to mention that with the war, with the full-scale invasion, we have seen obviously the environment for Ukrainian journalists in Ukraine deteriorating. We have documented the cases of 13 journalists who were killed while reporting and news gathering. And we're also looking into the cases of 2 other journalists. And you probably heard some other numbers, higher numbers, 40-something journalists from other organizations, Ukrainian organizations. And whenever I hear that, just preventing your question, I want to explain that we don't, in our statistics, we don't include those journalists who were killed as soldiers. And you probably know this better than me, that a lot of journalists, as well as people from all different walks of life in Ukraine, decided to join the army or to become volunteers and fight against the occupying army of Russia. So if a journalist was killed as a soldier while fighting, we don't include them in our database of the killed journalists. That's why our numbers are lower. We include only those journalists who were working as journalists, reporting or news gathering when they were killed. But even 15 15 journalists is a very high number. It's the highest number in recent years of all conflicts. And this is a huge blow to the journalistic community of Ukraine. And I wanted to speak a little bit about Ukraine. You know, we have worked on Ukraine for as long as Ukraine has been independent, since 1992. As I said, we have documented the cases of journalists, just like in other countries, of journalists who were killed for journalism, like Pavel Sheremet, whose car exploded in 2016. And we worked on his case. We met with then President Poroshenko of Ukraine. Our delegation traveled to Kiev on the first anniversary of Sheremet's killing in 2017. We published a special report, and we advocated for ending impunity in his case. But unfortunately, nobody has been brought to justice. And of course, now with the war, I think this investigation into the killing of Sheremet has to be postponed. But I hope that eventually, when Ukraine is free and you know, all territories of it are liberated, then the Ukrainian authorities will turn their attention to these older cases of journalist killings, because achieving justice in these cases is very important, because it means that other journalists can continue working in safety. And just as Ali said at the beginning, we have a lot of resources for journalists. We not just the Ukrainian journalists, but especially Ukrainian journalists. And I don't know if I can share my screen. I really wanted to, maybe this one.
Victoria, can we help in sharing? I think it's going to be very successful. Thank you. All
yeah,
good.
Can you see it?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay. So
Thank
this
you.
is our website. And if you go to our website, you will see the databases, and I wanted to show them. So here, journalists killed, journalists imprisoned, missing, if we don't know where they are. And this is the database of journalists, as I said, killed in Russia. Here you can see 82 journalists and media workers killed in Russia since 1992 up to today. And here you can choose location, and I can just show you as an example. If we choose Ukraine, then we will also see a lot of Ukraine, this is Russia and Ukraine. Let me just untick Russia. Okay. So this is just Ukraine. And you would see that a lot of them died in crossfire. Andrea Rochelle, for example, died while covering the conflict in May 2014 in eastern Ukraine. Andrei Mironov was his fixer from the Russian organization Memorial. But then you will see murders here as well. So this is a very good database if you want to look at it. But I also wanted to show you the database of journalists imprisoned in Russia, 19 journalists, as I said. And this is the situation as of December the 1st, 2022, because we publish our report on imprisoned journalists around the world in December every year, and we take a snapshot of the situation on December the 1st, 2022. So right now it would be more than 19 because of Gershkovich and a couple of other cases. So here you will see that we also list Crimean journalists under Russia, because they are either held in occupied Crimea in the territory of Russia, or, for example, these journalists, Osman Arifmetov, Remzi Bekirov, Rustem Sheikh-Aliyev, they are held on the Russian territory. They're Ukrainian journalists from Crimea that are held in Rostov-on-Don, for example. That's why we we list them under Russia because it is the Russian authorities that are responsible for detaining them. And then I wanted to show you this page on journalist safety. Here you can go on the main page, you can go to safety resources, and you will see how to get help, different resources. And let me just go on war reporting, physical safety during war reporting. That's very important for Ukraine, right? A lot of journalists, foreign correspondents want to go to Ukraine to report, also Ukrainian journalists themselves reporting on the conflict. And here you can see that we have these safety advisories in different languages, including Ukrainian. So Ukrainian, Russian, and English at least. So you're very welcome to check out these resources, and there are other languages, as you can see. And I'm going to stop here and see if there are any questions.
Dear Gulnoza, thank you so much for this most important work for the world, for this speech full of facts which can leave no one indifferent, for every single person whose life you have saved. I apologize for my internet today and for the technical mix-up. My speech froze at the beginning, and I was not able to give the floor to the Dean of Sociology School, who has come to greet you specifically. I would like to apologize for that and do so now, if you permit, before the questions are posed. We hope we have
course.
Dear Olena Sergeyevna Muradyan with us. I apologize for the technical mix-up, dear Olena Sergeyevna, Professor of Sociology, Dean of Sociology School of Vasilka Razin National University, member of European Sociological Association and International Sociological Association, and the head of the research project, ARDU, Adaptation of Regional Diversity in Ukraine. Dear Olena Sergeyevna, I deeply apologize for the technical situation I've had today. Would you please kindly forgive me and say your greeting word? Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that.
Yeah, thank you, Darlina. First
Deeply
of all, small thing that I would like to add. First of all, I came here really for this lecture. I'm sociologist, I'm not a journalist, but anyway, in our university and especially in our faculty, we have one of educational program connected to journalism, and that's why I really understand why all this topic, especially today, very important. So it doesn't matter when, but I really very welcome to see dear Gulnara in this, let's say, online university for now. I hope after the war we will have possibility to see you physically. But connected to this topic, you know, I'm thinking, and that's what I'm thinking even before, during the war, from one point of view, all local journalists in Ukraine, somehow, not all, but mostly of them, have been forced to, let's say, transform their activity into the war correspondence. Yeah, that's one thing. From another point of view, that's what I see as a person, and there are a lot of people who are staying in this hot zone in Kharkiv, Kherson, many cities. We also became somehow someone who recording all this information, who are maybe not local journalists, but someone who see what is going on. But from another point, when we talk about the journalists and media workers at the professionals, and I have many issues, many questions about how we should educate this new generation now. Yeah, what we should to tell them about this profession. And I'm very happy that this your lecture, dear Gulnoza, is in live format. So, and also that our students will be able to see this in record, because for me, I am definitely will advise it to my departments, media communication department, because nowadays we have a lot of publications, a lot of speeches about what's happened after the 1 year with this journalist profession, with them, many people talk about the deaths of people from First Army Force, from civilians, but not so many talk about how dangerous are this profession nowadays. And someone really, it's some kind of responsibility to have this statistic as you show, and this your resource has really important as for me, this important information to see not just journalists, but also media workers, because we are in Kharkiv border region. So as you can see, we have media center in our university. We see how many journalists, foreign journalists come here and later go to Bakhmut direction, etc., etc. And now there is a point, what is most dangerous for them? Is this physical danger, or what's about censorship? Where is this division between to get information and not, how is in English, not to give problems to army people who try to save some part of information. That's not everyone can be recorded, not everyone can be seen, and not everyone in big cities in urban space should be seen by civilians, because we can see how army group and regrouping, etc. Many ethical issues, as for me, really important issues. And I don't know, do we have questions or do we have answers on these questions? Yes, and point is, this war have started not from last year, from 2004, and I'm really thankful that you point all these data, because nowadays, as soon as war going on, we should understand that this profession is very dangerous, a lot of ethical moments, a lot of new rules of interaction between the government, between the people who are protecting us, between civilians also, how to be, how to get reporting, how to get materials and not to hurt these people with their trauma, etc., etc. I don't have questions, but I have these kind of comments that this topic is really very interesting, and I really appreciate that you also work with database. This is something that's really neat, because official statistic, what I saw when I was preparing to meeting with you, that we saw that's a bit more than 10 journalists that were killed for this year, but I'm sure the quantity is much more, because for now we don't know real statistics, not about civilians, not about even journalists. So this is really a topic that we will discover later. Thanks.
Thank you so much, dear Elena Sergeyevna. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your participation, for such a contribution to the discussion, for such a feedback that we've received. Dear Gulnoza, thank you very much for your most thought-provoking speech. Dear members, dear Karazin academic community, would you please, our students, our staff, our faculty, we have some questions already. Ms. Trach, would you please? Pani Christina Trach, the floor is yours. You're welcome with your question to our dear guest. Would you please? Thank you.
First of all, I'm really grateful for your lecture. Thank you so much. It was a really interesting lecture. I'm not a journalist by profession, but I'm a philologist. And for me, it was also really interesting to learn a lot of useful information. I have two questions. The first question, what difficulties do you most often face as a journalist and as a communication specialist? And the second one, do journalists have freedom of speech, or do they publish only what the state dictates to them?
Those are excellent questions, Christina. Thank you. About the second part, of course, there needs to be freedom of speech guaranteed by the Constitution, whether it is here in the United States or in Ukraine. In both countries, the constitutions guarantee freedom of speech and freedom of the media. And journalists should be able to report freely on any issues they choose. And that is not illegal unless they incite violence or they make racist remarks and that sort of thing. And that is regulated by legislations. So it is freedom of speech. Journalists don't have to walk the line that the authorities tell them, but that is unfortunately the case in many countries. As I said, in Russia, if you want to be able to continue working, oftentimes you have to, you cannot deviate from the Kremlin established narrative, especially on the war. As you know, when the war started, when the full-scale invasion started last year, the Russian authorities even banned the use of the word war in regards to the conflict in Ukraine. So they instructed all media to use this term SVO, which is special military operation in Russian. And to the first question you asked, I would rather speak about journalists and the challenges they meet, particularly in Ukraine, because I work in New York. I'm in safety comparing to many of my colleagues in Ukraine. So we are in touch with a lot of journalists in Ukraine, and in some cases I meet with them in person. Alona Muradyan raised very important questions about physical safety and the issues of ethics and how they should cover certain issues, especially the war. And one of the biggest challenges for journalists in Ukraine, especially those who cover the conflict, the war correspondents, is obviously physical safety. But what we at CPJ also notice is that there is a very heavy psychological toll of this war on journalists, even on those who do not necessarily go to the conflict zone, to the front line or the occupied or liberated territories to report, because I think this is a collective trauma that the whole nation of Ukrainians has been experiencing since 2014 for the past 9 years, but especially strongly since February last year. And we at CPJ try to help journalists, Ukrainian journalists, with providing them with psychological sessions. We give grants to journalists and they can choose their own expert, psychologist or mental health expert, whatever you call it, in order to work with them and to basically take care of their mental health. That's one of the requirements. And also there are other kinds of assistance we provide. For example, recently we approved a financial grant to a journalist who was injured in the leg last year while covering the conflict. He is a camera operator, and now he will be able to have a physical therapy in order to get better and to make his leg good again so he can walk without any problems.
Thank you so much, dear Gulnoza. We've got another question with your kind permission. Miss Marta, would you please take the floor with your question? Thank you so much. We see your hand. Would you be so welcome to be next?
Excuse me, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can, absolutely.
Yeah, thank you. Hello, it's really a pleasure to meet you. Thank you very much for this like amazing and really informative lecture. And I wanted to ask, how, in your opinion, how much responsibility is on like a journalist in terms of the crimes of the war, and where like this line between like how to define if the person was forced, like they chose like their career and like their safety sometimes, and if they are really supporting the war and the crimes, and how to get to know and what punishment, if any, they will receive.
Are you talking about journalists who decided to support the war because they were forced to do so?
Forced, or they really want to support
decided for themselves?
Yeah, I mean, like in terms of like the public and the politic, and how much responsibility they is on them if they are supporting like the war.
Yeah, that's a very good question. That goes back to the ethics and professional integrity of journalists. We have seen a lot of journalists, for example, in Russia, Russian journalists, and oftentimes they are called war correspondents. They go to the front line from the side, the Russian side, and into the occupied territories of Ukraine, and they report it in a very pro-war manner. And unfortunately, there are a lot of people who support them. And that's, for me, that's the result of the propaganda that has been going on in Russia for many years. Because what we see, of course, it's impossible to find true research or surveys or polls because they're not conducted independently in Russia, but just anecdotally and from what I see in social media, from comments and such, I see a lot of people who actually support Putin and his war against Ukraine, and they fell victims of this narrative that Russia is fighting against the Nazi regime of Ukraine, and they're trying to liberate Ukraine, and people in liberated territories are happy, and so on. So there are a lot of journalists who support that narrative, and it's very difficult for me to speak about it because there is no clear line. As I said, if there is incitement into violence, that's one thing. And we at CPJ have not been defending journalists who would call Ukrainians different names. For example, you probably know of the case of Vladlen Tatarsky, the blogger, the military blogger who was recently killed. So, and then when he was killed, it happened just a day or two after the detention of Evan Gershkovich in Moscow. The Russian officials said, why isn't the international community defending Tatarsky the way they're defending Gershkovich? And we at CPJ are not defending Tatarsky because, first of all, he fought in the war, so he is not a journalist, but also because he was using different, words to insult Ukrainians, and that's not what journalists do. But when it comes to, so insults or inciting violence, that's more clear. But when it is just support for the war, it's very difficult for us to judge, and especially if it is Ukrainian journalists. And I don't know if your question was about Ukrainian journalists. I don't think I have a clear-cut answer for that.
No, it's more about Russian journalists. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the question, and thank you so much, dear Gulnoza, for the answer. If you permit, I had a little remark, maybe not so much a question of myself being a child of the Soviet Union, having grown up, having been born in the Soviet Union, and my childhood was largely fell into the decade of 1980s and the beginning of 1990s. We had many friends. Some of the friends were Russian friends, some of the friends were Ukrainian friends. But what I've noticed, and since you've mentioned this narrative, probably we could speak, if you permit this, in terms of this narrative as a propaganda narrative. In some way, I have noticed that those people like me, for example, some of my friends who were originally born in Russia, but for example, who immigrated, say, back in 1991, they are no journalists, but they're people of different professions, like IT experts, lawyers, some of them academicians, and so on. Those people who lived outside of Russia, they were able to preserve, so to say, an objective look. They were, so to say, beyond the framework of this narrative. And those people who stayed in Russia, I would say, their opinion was, since the beginning of the war, it has been largely, well, from what I've noticed, of course, we all have our subjective opinions, largely biased, by this narrative that they were totally represented with. So do you think that probably the different way that Ukraine has come since 1991 and Russia since 1991, when Ukraine became independent, can it be accounted for by the people of Russia being within this paradigm of this narrative? And maybe it largely has to deal with propaganda. So how it has happened so that people from the same circle, same friends, same group, same society, in childhood, they have come such different ways, and the ability for analysis, reflection is present with the people who were in Canada, in the United States, in Ukraine, in Europe, but not the ones who have stayed in Russia all this time. Does it have to deal with this narrative that they have to witness each day? I'm
absolutely,
sorry,
absolutely.
A little bit emotional. I was trying to talk
No,
about
absolutely. That's a very important question, and it could be probably the most important question of today's discussion, I think, because if you speak about the war in Ukraine, we cannot not touch on propaganda and disinformation and misinformation. And I agree with you, absolutely. People who live in Russia, they have been subject to propaganda and disinformation for years. And it is not surprising that the propaganda, works and people become very pro-Putin and anti-Ukrainian. And unfortunately, this paradigm is not limited to the Russian borders only geographically. I've seen a lot of pro-Putin people in Germany, among Russian-speaking people, or in other countries, because in Serbia, for example, and because they also may watch the same TV channels, Channel 1, for example, they may be in touch with their friends who are in Russia and family members who are in Russia. So the worst thing about propaganda is that it works. It always affects a certain population, a part of the population, not in Russia, anywhere in the world. And in Russia, the authorities have worked for years to ensure that there is propaganda and there is no independent reporting, just as I said, because especially if you are, my age or older living in Russia, especially older people, for them, TV is the main source of information. And what the Russian authorities, the Putin government did soon after he became president is they tried to establish control over the media outlets, and TV, broadcasters were the very first ones, because they knew that in every household across Russia, there is a TV set, and every family sits down in the evening having their dinner and watching TV. Younger people are different. They used, before the full-scale invasion, when the authorities started blocking a lot of media outlets and social media like Instagram, they used internet as the main source. of information, younger people, maybe those, millennials or Gen Z, Generation Z. But older people, yeah, absolutely. And that's why we see a lot of pro-Putin people and pro-war people among the older generation. And now with a lot of websites being blocked and social media not accessible in Russia, people have to use VPNs, and some VPNs work and others don't work, and you have to pay for it, you have to learn how to use it. So it's quite a challenge for a lot of Russians. And what we have seen is that some independent media outlets like Meduza, who created this PDF format of all their reports, which can be shared without any problem with their friends and relatives, including elderly ones inside Russia. So, first of all, as far as I know from what Meduza says, it's working. And second of all, media outlets that are now in exile, not just Meduza, but many others, have to become very creative in order to share their content. But even when they do, still there is this environment of fear among Russians. So every time when I read a post by a person who is declared a foreign agent in Russia, and they have to add that to their post, that this post is made by a person declared a foreign agent in Russia, yada yada, in capital letters, I understand that this is out of concern for people inside Russia who may share that content or may want to share that content. So yeah, unfortunately, propaganda works, and propaganda affected a lot of Russians. That's why we see Russians supporting this war. Well, Alena, I see your note. Thank you so much for joining. It was a pleasure. Thank you, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much for being with us, Elena Sergeyevna. Dear Gulnoza, I would like to thank you for everything. It's been an amazing hour. Like, I really hope that you would come to us after the war, after it becomes safe. Our university would welcome you so much. And I was, if you permit, I just wanted to ask final little question. Maybe you would share what you were as a person when you decided to do such amazingly important work. I cannot picture what could be more important than saving people's lives and fighting for people's freedom. Probably, how did you realize that you wanted to do this? Maybe you came across a journalist story that influenced you so much, or a person who fascinated you. Maybe you've read a book or seen a documentary. Because what was your first touch with the if it's okay to ask, with this particular mission?
Yeah,
with this particular mission. Thank you so much.
No, I think
I feel
saving people's lives is probably an exaggeration, but helping journalists, yes. And I'm a journalist. I worked as a journalist for many years. What brought me to journalism was that I was doing my PhD in political science, and while I was researching, I started meeting people who were truly independent in the way they were thinking, and that got me interested. And then when I got an offer to work for an American media outlet, I started filing my reports, and I loved it, because being a journalist also means, especially in closed societies, which Uzbekistan was at the time, means giving the voice to the voiceless. And then I was persecuted in Uzbekistan for my reporting. I was accused of libel and defamation for several of my articles, and I was also threatened to be charged with espionage, and I had to flee the country. And I wasn't able to go back there for 9 years. So for 9 years, I wouldn't be able to see my dad, and with my mom, I met elsewhere in another country. So that was a very tough time. And it was during those years when I decided to join CPJ, because I was in that difficult situation once, and I was in safety in the United States after that. And I thought, I want to help journalists who are in a similar situation. that's what brought me to CPJ and to press freedom advocacy. Thank you so much for your question.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your support, this lecture, this talk, and everything you've said. For me, for all our Karazinites, it would be something to rely on. We will keep it in our memory, and we will have it as a solid moment of faith. For me, it's a solid moment of faith that will help us fight through everything we are going through to a much better future, to victory. I'm so grateful you responded my letter, for your time, for your corrections, for everything, for your guiding me. Like, it was amazing. It was so amazing. It was great experience of working with a person of such fantastic importance to the world. I cannot express how grateful I am for all the help you've given to Ukrainian journalists, not only to Ukrainian ones, to every single person who fell within the scope of your attention, for your being present with us today, for your visit to our Vasil Karazin Kharkiv National University. We are 40 kilometers from the borderline, but we are a very, very free city and very free university. We will remain like that until the day of the victory comes, and afterwards as well. I hope you will, for your visit, very much.
I'd love to come, and thank you so much for having me. And you are the ones who deserve all the compliments for staying strong, for continuing your studies. And I hope Ukraine will be liberated. Your city of Kharkiv will be free and safe very soon. And I would love to come and visit and meet you all in person if there is a chance.
It would be an honor. I'm sure Olena Sergeyevna would say it. She just needs to be at the meeting right now, but I'm absolutely sure, if you permit kindly, I will give your contact, your email to Olena Sergeyevna.
Of course, yeah. That would be my pleasure to be in touch. Thank you.
Very close collaboration. Thank you so much, dear Gulnoza, and most of luck. And please, for those journalists who are within the scope of your help, let them be safe. Let them stay safe, and let everyone be saved and doing their most incredible, important mission with your help.
Thank you.
It's been an honor. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for this amazing hour. Thank you, Pani Victoria, for your technical help. Thank you so much. Thank you for all the people who produced questions, dear friends.